Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today, we're going to be looking at a case that was featured on 48 Hours
Okay.
about an Air Force colonel
Sounds interesting.
who died under mysterious circumstances.
Mhm.
Officially, he was ruled a suicide. But his widow, Tracy, believes there's more to the story.
Okay, interesting.
And she actually, she suspected foul play.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, a judge actually agreed with her in a civil trial.
Really?
So we're going to break down all the different angles of this case
Mm.
so you can decide for yourself what you think really happened.
I love these kinds of cases.
So this is the case of Air Force Colonel Philip Shue.
Okay.
He was found dead in his car after a crash in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward,
Yeah.
a car crash,
Yeah.
but the injuries on his body
Mm-hmm.
didn't really line up with what you would expect.
Oh, really?
So he had duct tape on his wrists and ankles,
Okay.
a gash on his chest,
Yeah.
and his nipples had been excised.
Oh, wow. That's...
Yeah. So Lieutenant Roger Anderson, who was supervising that part of the investigation, immediately suspected that there was something more to this than just a simple car accident.
I see. Yeah, that does sound suspicious.
So the question is,
Yeah.
were these injuries self-inflicted,
Right.
as in a suicide, or was there something more sinister going on?
Right. So you've got...
Now, the medical examiner who first looked at the case,
Okay.
Dr. Vincent Diallo, concluded that the injuries were self-inflicted. He found lidocaine as
Okay.
a local anesthetic
Mm-hmm.
in Colonel Shue's system, and so he theorized that he used it to numb the pain before inflicting these injuries on himself.
Okay, I see.
But Tracy, Colonel Shue's widow,
Mm.
she wasn't convinced by this, so she hired her own pathologist,
Okay.
a Dr. Wett, and he had a completely different interpretation.
Oh, really?
Dr. Wett found no evidence to support the self-infliction theory and suggested that the injuries were actually more consistent with torture.
Wow.
So you got these two medical professionals
Yeah.
who are both looking at the same evidence, but they're coming to completely different conclusions.
Well, how can that be?
And that's one of the really interesting things about forensic pathology,
I guess so, yeah.
is that it's not always an exact science.
Okay.
There's a lot of interpretation involved. And so I think this case really highlights that challenge, that you can have two experts
Yeah.
looking at the same thing and coming up with completely different ideas.
So what kind of factors could cause those differences in interpretations?
Well, I think in this case you have the lidocaine.
Okay.
So one doctor saying, well, he must have used this to numb himself before he did this.
Mm-hmm.
The other doctor saying, well, there's not enough evidence to really support that.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes the presence or absence of certain markers like that
Okay.
can be open to interpretation.
I see.
And then there can also be variations in the way that injuries are examined and documented.
Mm-hmm.
And all those things can lead to these different conclusions.
Yeah, I can see that.
So it's not as simple as just looking at an injury and saying, okay, this
Yeah.
is definitely a suicide or this is definitely a murder. There's a lot of nuance involved.
Oh, so you really have to look at it from all angles.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so important to have a really thorough investigation.
Yeah.
And to consider all the possible explanations.
Yeah, for sure.
And this case gets even more complicated because there's also the issue of motive.
Oh, okay.
So Colonel Shue had $1 million life insurance policy.
Okay. $1 million.
And guess who owned it?
I don't know.
His first wife, Nancy,
Oh, wow.
who he had a very bitter divorce from.
Interesting.
And he'd actually asked her to cancel the policies. But she claimed she couldn't afford to.
Okay.
So that's already a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, a little bit.
And then you add on top of that, that Colonel Shue had been receiving these anonymous letters
Anonymous letters.
warning him that Nancy and her current husband,
Okay.
who was an active duty Air Force pilot,
Oh, wow.
were plotting to kill him for the insurance money.
That's like something out of a movie or something.
Yeah, it really is. It sounds crazy, right?
And it does.
But Colonel Shue, he took these letters seriously.
Yeah, I can see why.
He confronted Nancy about them. So clearly he was concerned about what they said.
Right. So how did the police or the Air Force handle these letters?
Well, that's where things get a bit murky.
Okay.
They were aware of the letters,
Yeah.
but it seems like they focused more on that initial suicide ruling
Yeah.
and what the medical examiner had found.
Oh, so they might have overlooked something really important.
Yeah, it's possible that some really crucial evidence
Mm-hmm.
was kind of pushed aside or maybe not given the attention it deserved.
I see.
Lieutenant Anderson, the lead investigator,
Mm-hmm.
actually later said that he regretted how certain aspects of the case were handled.
What did he say?
He felt that the investigation might have been too quick to dismiss the possibility of foul play.
Oh, okay.
And, we're talking about a potential murder investigation here.
Right.
So every detail is crucial.
So what else do we know about the investigation?
Well, for one thing, there was this jurisdictional dispute
A jurisdictional dispute.
between the local police and the state police at the crash site,
Oh.
which really delayed the investigation.
Ah.
And it could have even compromised the crime scene.
What do you mean a jurisdictional dispute?
So basically, neither agency wanted to take full responsibility
Oh, wow.
for processing the scene.
Really?
And Lieutenant Anderson believes that this led to a less thorough investigation.
Oh, that's not good.
No, it's not. So you've got these conflicting medical opinions.
Yeah.
You've got the life insurance policy as a possible motive.
Right.
You've got these unsettling letters.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got a botched investigation on top of it all.
Wow.
It really does feel like there are more questions than answers.
It does, yeah. So what happens next?
Well, we haven't even talked about the psychological autopsy yet.
The psychological autopsy, what's that?
So the Air Force conducted a psychological autopsy,
Okay.
which is basically an attempt to reconstruct a deceased person's state of mind leading up to their death.
Oh, okay.
It's often used in cases where suicide is suspected.
Mm.
But the thing is, these psychological autopsies, they can be really unreliable.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, for one thing, it was conducted 2 years after Colonel Shu's death.
2 years.
So they're relying on people's memories from 2 years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And they're also relying on secondhand information,
Yeah.
which, can be really unreliable.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of it was based on these assumptions about Colonel Shu's personality
Okay.
and his behavior,
Yeah.
rather than concrete evidence.
So it sounds like this psychological autopsy could have been biased
It's definitely possible, yeah.
towards that initial suicide ruling.
You always have to be careful
Yeah.
about confirmation bias in these types of investigations where
Mhm.
people are maybe unconsciously looking for information that supports what they already believe.
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
So I think we need to be really careful about taking any of these findings at face value.
Yeah, I agree.
There's clearly a lot of room for interpretation and potential bias.
It is really fascinating, though.
Yeah, it is.
It really makes you think about, all the different angles.
Yeah.
And how complicated these investigations can be.
So we've laid out some pretty compelling arguments for both suicide and murder.
We have, yeah.
So how do we start untangling all this?
That's a good question.
How do we make sense of all this conflicting information? Well, to really understand this case, I think we need to look at what happened next.
Okay.
So the civil trial that Tracy, Colonel Shu's widow, filed against Nancy and the insurance companies.
Oh, wow.
That's where things take a really dramatic turn.
Oh, I can't wait to hear about that. Yeah, so this civil trial, this is really where things get interesting.
Okay, so walk me through this a little bit. What were the key arguments that were presented?
Well, Tracy's legal team, they argued that all of the evidence was really pointing towards murder.
Okay.
And they highlighted, the conflicting medical opinions that we talked about, those anonymous letters,
Right.
and the fact that Nancy had refused to cooperate with the investigation.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty strong case. What was the counter-argument?
Well, Nancy's lawyers,
Yeah.
they stuck with the suicide theory.
Yeah.
They pointed to the initial medical examiner's report
Mm-hmm.
and that psychological autopsy that the Air Force had done.
Right.
And they also downplayed the significance of those anonymous letters.
Okay. How did they do that?
Well, they basically said, anyone could have written those.
Right. Anyone could have sent them.
Exactly.
So basically we're back to square one.
Pretty much.
We've got these two completely different stories.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
In a surprise move, Nancy was actually dropped as a defendant in the case.
Oh, wow.
And the judge decided that he was going to rule on the remaining issues himself.
Hold on. So the judge basically said, I'm going to decide this myself.
Yeah, pretty much.
That doesn't happen very often, does it?
No, it's pretty unusual. In most civil trials, you'd have a jury who would make the decision. But in this case, the judge, he felt like he could be fair and impartial, and he could reach a decision just based on the evidence.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What was the decision?
Well, after reviewing all of the evidence
Mm-hmm.
and hearing the arguments from both sides, the judge declared that Colonel Shu was murdered.
What?
Yeah.
So he completely contradicted the police and the Air Force?
Yeah, he did. It was a pretty shocking ruling.
Wow. Okay, so what happened next? I mean, was the case reopened?
Well, not exactly.
What do you mean?
Even though the judge in the civil trial ruled that it was a murder,
Right.
the local authorities, they refused to change Colonel Shu's death certificate.
Oh, wow.
They said that the judge's decision wasn't enough to prove murder in a criminal case.
So it wasn't binding on them.
Exactly.
So even though a judge said this looks like murder,
Mm,
officially, Colonel Shu's death is still being treated as a suicide.
that's right. It's a really strange situation.
It is, yeah. It kind of highlights the difference between civil and criminal trials, right? Like in a civil trial, you just have to prove that something's more likely than not.
That's right. The preponderance of the evidence.
But in a criminal trial, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mm-hmm. A much higher standard.
So Tracy, she won her civil case.
Yeah.
But that didn't actually lead to any charges or any changes in the official record.
Right. It's kind of a bittersweet victory.
Yeah, it is.
You know, it validates her claims in a way, but it doesn't really bring her any closer to finding out who actually killed her husband.
So what happens now? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, it's a long shot,
Okay.
but she could try to pressure the authorities to reopen the case, especially now that she has this ruling from the judge.
Oh, but she'd need some new evidence. Right?
Yeah, she'd need something that wasn't presented before.
Something brand new.
Something that would really convince them to take another look.
Okay, so let's talk about those anonymous letters for a second.
Okay.
Did they ever figure out who wrote them?
No, they never did.
Oh, wow.
They analyzed them, but there were no fingerprints or DNA that could be linked to anyone.
So they really are a complete mystery.
Yeah, we still don't know if there were genuine warnings or if they were just some kind of cruel prank.
Or even an attempt to mislead the investigation.
That's true, too.
And then you add on top of that, that Nancy and her husband, they both refused to answer any questions.
Oh, they took the Fifth.
Yeah, they invoked the Fifth Amendment.
So they didn't want to incriminate themselves.
Exactly.
Which, you know, it is their right.
Of course.
But it does make you wonder.
It does.
Why wouldn't they want to clear their name?
So even though Nancy was dropped from the lawsuit, she's still kind of in the picture.
Yeah.
Because of those letters.
Right.
And the fact that she wouldn't answer questions.
It's like a big question mark hanging over them.
And then there's this whole other layer.
Right, so
There were these allegations that some of Colonel Shu's injuries were actually consistent with sadomasochistic practices.
Oh, wow. Where did that come from?
Well, it came out during the trial
Okay.
that Nancy, his first wife,
Yeah.
she was a certified sex therapist.
Really?
And she had actually studied sadomasochism.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So Tracy's lawyers, they suggested that maybe Colonel Shu's injuries, especially those excised nipples,
Right.
could have been inflicted by someone who knew about that kind of stuff.
Oh, I see.
But Tracy denied that Colonel Shu had any interest in that. And there really wasn't any other evidence to support that theory.
So it was just a possibility that they were exploring.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so we've got a lot of pieces to this puzzle.
We do.
We've got conflicting medical opinions.
Right.
We've got the life insurance, those anonymous letters.
The investigation.
The psychological autopsy, the civil trial.
Yeah, and even this whole sadomasochism thing.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's really easy to get lost in all the details.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that at the heart of all of this is a man who died under really suspicious circumstances.
Right.
And a grieving widow who believes that he was murdered.
And we still don't know for sure what happened.
Yeah, we don't. And I think that's what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating at the same time.
So where do we go from here? I mean, how do we make sense of all this?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is, yeah.
I mean, was Colonel Shu's death a suicide? Or was he murdered?
I guess that's what we need to figure out.
Yeah.
So what do you think so far? Anything jumping out at you?
Honestly, I'm not sure. It could go either way.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there's evidence to support both sides. I guess I'm leaning a little bit more towards the murder theory.
Okay, why is that?
Just because of all the suspicious circumstances. You know, the letters and the fact that a judge actually ruled that it was murder.
Right.
But I also know that we still have a lot of unanswered questions.
That's true. We do.
So I'm keeping an open mind.
Okay.
But yeah, it's definitely a case that makes you think. So I guess we'll just have to keep digging.
Yeah, we'll see what else we can find out.
So we've really gotten into the nitty-gritty of this case.
We have.
But I'm curious about kind of the bigger picture here.
Okay.
What are the implications of a case like this?
You mean for the justice system?
Yeah, like what does this case tell us about how these kinds of investigations are handled?
Well, I think this case shows just how complicated it can be to get to the truth.
Right.
When you've got conflicting evidence, you've got expert opinions that don't agree, and all these unanswered questions.
It makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where there's doubt about what really happened.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I keep thinking about Tracy, too. She never gave up on this,
She didn't. No.
even when it seemed like everyone else had accepted the suicide ruling.
It's pretty inspiring.
It is. It says a lot about her resilience
Yeah.
and her belief in what she thought was true.
It shows you the power of fighting for what you believe in,
Yeah, even when it's hard.
especially when it's hard.
And even when other people doubt you.
And she did get that ruling from the judge,
She did.
which, that was a big win for her.
It was.
It validated what she'd been saying all along.
So it is possible to make a difference,
It is.
even in a case as complicated as this.
Even when it seems like you're up against a wall.
And I can't stop thinking about those letters.
Hmm.
Do you think Colonel Shu could still be alive if he had taken those letters straight to the police?
That's a tough question.
It is.
We'll never know for sure. But it does make you think about the importance of speaking up if you think something's wrong.
Right, even if you're not sure.
Don't be afraid to ask for help.
Well, this case has been a wild ride.
It has.
So many twists and turns.
I feel like I've learned a lot
Me too.
about, how these investigations work
Hmm.
and how tricky it can be to separate fact from fiction.
What's the one thing you want her listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest thing is that truth is often really hard to find. Even when you've got all the evidence and you go through the whole legal process,
Right.
sometimes you're still left with unanswered questions.
Like in this case.
Exactly.
So I guess what we all need to do is just keep asking questions,
Mm-hmm.
keep an open mind, and never stop searching for the truth.
Well said.
And if you want to dive even deeper into this case,
Mm.
you can find the full 48 Hours episode online.
It's definitely worth a watch.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.